To capture a warship on the high seas is a feat of naval supremacy. To capture a submarine, a vessel literally designed to disappear, sink and take its secrets to the crushed depth of the ocean abyss, is an act of tactical insanity. By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic Ocean was a graveyard of shattered steel and frozen sailors, a battlefield where the United States Navy and the German Kriegsmarine had been locked in a brutal multi-year war of attrition. Submarines do not surrender. They are engineered with scuttling charges, flood valves, and strict standing orders that dictate the boat must die before the enemy can set foot on its deck. Yet, on June 4, 1944, just 2 days before the Allied Armada stormed the beaches of Normandy, a rogue American naval captain decided that simply sinking German U-boats was no longer enough. He wanted to steal one. Welcome back to the channel. Before we dissect one of the most audacious naval operations in human history, I have a question for you. Have you ever stood inside the cramped, claustrophobic steel pressure hull of a captured enemy submarine and wondered what it took to drag that lethal machine out of the ocean alive? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to keep seeing deep dives into the most ruthless military tactics and hardware ever deployed, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. To understand the sheer magnitude of capturing the U-505, we have to strip away the myth and look at the cold, hard strategic roots of the Battle of the Atlantic. This was not a war of glorious fleet engagements like Midway or Leyte Gulf. This was a dirty, grinding, logistical spreadsheet of death. Following the end of the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles explicitly banned Germany from possessing a submarine fleet. The Allied powers had learned their lesson after the Kaiser's U-boats nearly starved Great Britain into submission. But treaties are only as strong as the steel backing them up. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the German Navy secretly rebuilt its submarine program through shell companies in the Netherlands, designing new boats and developing new doctrines. When war erupted in 1939, Admiral Karl Dönitz unleashed his wolf packs, relying on a deeply calculated mathematical doctrine known as the Tonnage War. The strategy was brutally simple. Germany did not need to defeat the Allied navies in a pitched battle. They only needed to sink merchant cargo ships faster than American and British shipyards could build them. If you sever the logistical artery of steel, oil, and food crossing the Atlantic, Great Britain starves, and the planned liberation of Europe dies on the drawing board. In the early months of 1942, during an offensive the Germans called Operation Drumbeat, this strategy nearly worked. German U-boats operated with absolute impunity right off the American East Coast. Americans standing on the beaches of New Jersey and Florida could literally watch the night sky glow orange from burning oil tankers. Why was the United States Navy, the most powerful industrial maritime force on Earth, bleeding out in its own backyard? The answer lies in the mid-Atlantic Gap, a massive stretch of open ocean that was entirely out of range of Allied land-based patrol aircraft. It was a dark zone, a black pit where U-boats could surface, recharge their batteries, coordinate attacks over the radio, and slaughter convoys without fear of aerial bombardment. But the real nightmare for the Allies was not just the geography. It was the intelligence blackout. The German military relied on the Enigma cipher machine to encrypt all radio communications. For a time, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had managed to crack the naval Enigma, allowing the Allies to reroute convoys around the wolf packs. Then, in February 1942, Dönitz introduced the M4 Enigma, adding a fourth rotor to the machine used by the submarine fleet. This single mechanical upgrade increased the mathematical combinations to unimaginable billions, plunging Allied intelligence completely into the dark. For nearly a year, the Allies suffered catastrophic shipping losses because they were fighting blind. To break the M4 Enigma, the Allies desperately needed the physical codebooks, the daily setting sheets, and the machine itself. But getting them meant boarding a sinking U-boat before the crew could destroy the evidence. Historically, boarding and capturing an enemy warship for its intelligence is a rare and bloody gamble. During the War of 1812, American frigates like the USS Constitution shocked the British Empire by demasting and boarding Royal Navy warships, proving that aggressive, point-blank naval combat could overcome a numerically superior foe. In World War I, the entire naval intelligence war shifted when the Russian Navy recovered German codebooks from the wrecked cruiser SMS Magdeburg in 1914. The United States Navy in 1944 needed its own Magdeburg moment. By 1943, the American industrial base had fully awakened, shifting the strategic balance of power. To close the mid-Atlantic gap, American shipyards led by industrialist Henry Kaiser began mass-producing a new weapon of war, the escort carrier. These were not the massive, heavily armored fleet carriers of the Pacific. These were cheap, slow, unarmored merchant hulls, slapped with a flat flight deck, derisively called jeep carriers, or combustible, vulnerable, and expendable by the men who sailed them. But what they lacked in armor, they made up for in sheer relentless utility. They allowed the United States Navy to push hunter-killer task groups directly into the Black Pit, hunting the hunters. Task Group 22. 3 was one of these specialized hunter-killer units, commanded by Captain Daniel Fiv Gallery. Gallery was a Chicago-born naval aviator, a maverick, and a man who thought more like a 17th-century pirate than a traditional naval officer. He commanded the USS Guadalcanal, a Casablanca-class escort carrier displacing 10,400 tons and measuring 512 feet long. The Guadalcanal was a floating target, capable of a sluggish 19 knots, meaning almost any surfaced U-boat could outrun it in a straight line. But Gallery did not rely on the speed of his ship. He relied on the speed of his aircraft and his escorts. The Guadalcanal carried a composite squadron of Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and FM-2 Wildcat fighters. The Avengers were the heavy hitters, armed with conventional depth charges, and a highly classified weapon known as the Mark 24 mine, which was actually an acoustic homing torpedo called Fido. If a U-boat submerged, Fido would listen for the cavitation of its propellers and hunt it down in the dark. Surrounding the carrier was a steel ring of 5 destroyer escorts: the USS Pillsbury, Pope, Flaherty, Chatelain, and Jenks. These were small, 200-ton sub-killers packed to the brim with advanced anti-submarine technology. They carried high-frequency direction finding gear, known as Huff-Duff, which could instantly triangulate the origin point of any German radio transmission. More importantly, they were armed with the Hedgehog. Why use a traditional depth charge that explodes at a preset depth, churning up the water and blinding your own sonar, when you can use a weapon that only detonates when it hits steel? The Hedgehog was a forward-throwing spigot mortar that launched a circular pattern of 24 projectiles, each packed with 35 pounds of Torpex high explosive. They sank rapidly, and if even one struck the hull of a U-boat, the resulting explosion would trigger the rest, cracking the submarine like an egg. This was the American hammer. Now let us look at the German anvil. The target of Gallery's obsession was the U-505, a Type IXC long-range U-boat. While the famous Type 7 U-boats were the workhorses of the North Atlantic, the Type Nice was a massive ocean-going predator designed to strike the Americas, the Caribbean, and the coast of Africa. She was 251 feet long, displacing over 1,100 tons on the surface, and powered by 2 massive MAN 9-cylinder diesel engines that gave her a staggering range of 13,450 nautical miles. She carried 22 torpedoes, feeding 4 bow tubes and 2 stern tubes. On her deck sat a 105mm artillery piece, backed up by twin anti-aircraft flak mounts to fight off Allied patrol planes. But hardware is only as effective as the men operating it, and the crew of U-505 was psychologically broken. The boat was widely considered cursed within the U-boat fleet. In late 1942, she had been heavily damaged by an Allied bomber, limping back to base barely afloat. Then came the catastrophic patrol of October 1943. While suffering a relentless, terrifying depth charge attack by British destroyers, the U-505's commander, Peter Zschech, snapped under the pressure. Right in the middle of the control room, surrounded by his terrified crew as the hull groaned and the lights flickered, Zschech drew his Walther pistol and committed suicide. It was an unprecedented collapse of command. Did the German High Command truly believe a crew could watch their captain blow his own brains out, wash his blood off the deck plates, and still function as a lethal apex predator? By the time Oberleutnant zur See Harald Lang took command in 1944, morale on U-505 was non-existent. They were ordered to patrol the waters off the coast of West Africa, a desolate hunting ground where the heat inside the steel tube regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew suffered from skin rot, exhaustion, and the creeping paranoia that the Allied hunter-killer groups were closing in, and they were right. Captain Gallery and Task Group 22. 3 had been stalking the sea lanes off Cape Verde, using Huff-Duff to intercept faint radio chatter. Gallery had specifically trained his boarding parties, outfitting them with Thompson's submachine guns, hand grenades, and flashlights, drilling them relentlessly on how to board a sinking sub, close the sea valves, and rip the Enigma machine from its mountings. His superiors thought he was out of his mind. You do not board a sinking bomb. By June 4, 1944, Task Group 22, 3 was critically low on fuel. The destroyers were running on fumes, and Gallery was forced to order the task group to turn north and head for the naval base at Casablanca. The hunt was seemingly over. The ocean had won again. But at 11:09 a.m., the sonar operator aboard the destroyer escort USS Chatelaine picked up a sharp metallic echo bouncing off a steel hull just 800 yards away. The ghost had been found. But finding a ghost in the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean is one thing. Trapping it, blasting it to the surface, and forcing a desperate crew to surrender their most guarded secrets alive requires a level of tactical violence that the Kriegsmarine never saw coming. The sonar operator aboard the USS Chatelaine did not hesitate. When the sharp, high-pitched metallic ping echoed through his headset, it was not the muffled, scattered return of a whale or a cold water thermocline. It was the undeniable, solid acoustic signature of a massive steel cylinder displacing water just beneath the surface. To understand the tactical geometry of what happened next, we have to look at the grim science of anti-submarine warfare in 1944. Hunting a U-boat was not a matter of simply dropping explosives into the ocean. It was a deadly, three-dimensional game of blindman's buff played in an unforgiving environment. The primary sensor of the American destroyer escorts was the ASDIC system, a highly directional sonar that sent out pulses of sound. If the sound waves hit a target, they bounced back, allowing the operator to calculate distance and bearing based on the time delay. But sonar had a critical, fatal flaw. As the attacking ship closed in on the submarine, the angle of the sonar beam would eventually pass over the top of the U-boat, creating a blind spot in the final, most crucial moments of the attack run. This blind spot had saved countless German submarines earlier in the war, allowing them to violently change course, while the attacking destroyer was effectively deaf. But the United States Navy had adapted. At 11:16 a.m., the Chatelaine closed the distance at flank speed, her bow cutting through the Atlantic swells. Instead of relying on standard depth charges dropped from the stern, the Chatelaine utilized the Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar system. The Hedgehog was designed specifically to eliminate the sonar blind spot. Mounted on the bow, it fired 24 contact-fused projectiles in an elliptical pattern, hurling them hundreds of feet ahead of the ship. Each projectile weighed 65 pounds and was packed with 35 pounds of Torpex, an explosive compound 50% more powerful than standard TNT. Because they only detonated on physical impact with a hard surface, a Hedgehog miss resulted in dead silence. The Chatelaine fired her first salvo. The crew held their breath, waiting for the massive underwater shockwave that would signal a kill. Nothing happened. The projectiles sank harmlessly into the abyss, missing the U-505 by a matter of yards. Down in the dark, inside the pressure hull of the U-505, Oberleutnant zur See, Harold Lang and his crew heard the terrifying splash of the projectiles entering the water above them. What happens to the human psyche when you are trapped in a claustrophobic steel pipe, hundreds of miles from home, listening to the enemy systematically try to crush you to death? For the German submariners, the psychological toll was absolute agony. Lang immediately ordered the boat to dive deeper and rig for silent running. The massive diesel engines were shut down, and the electric motors were engaged to reduce noise. The temperature inside the boat, already sweltering from the African patrol, spiked dramatically as the air conditioning was secured to maintain absolute silence. Men took off their shoes and whispered, sweating profusely as condensation dripped from the steel bulkheads onto the deck plates. But the U-505 was a Type IXC, a massive, heavy boat displacing over 1,100 tons, and she was sluggish to respond. On the surface, the American hunter-killer group was tightening the noose. Captain Gallery, watching from the bridge of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, immediately ordered his ship to turn hard away from the contact to avoid a potential torpedo spread. Meanwhile, two FM-2 Wildcat fighters circling above spotted a massive dark shadow moving just below the surface of the blue Atlantic water. The aircraft banked sharply, diving toward the ocean and firing their .50 caliber machine guns into the water. They were not trying to sink the submarine with bullets. They were acting as aerial spotters, using their tracer rounds to paint a giant glowing arrow on the surface of the ocean, pointing directly at the submerged U-boat for the destroyers to follow. Guided by the aircraft, the Chatelaine swung around for a second pass, this time supported by the USS Pillsbury and USS Jenks. At 11:21 a.m., the Chatelaine passed directly over the churning water marked by the fighters and unleashed a devastating pattern of 14 Mark 9 depth charges. These were not contact weapons. These were massive, 300-pound barrels of Torpex set to detonate at a specific hydrostatic depth. When a depth charge explodes underwater, it does not destroy a submarine with fire or shrapnel. It destroys it with a kinetic shockwave. Water cannot be compressed, so the expanding gas bubble from the explosion acts like a massive hydraulic hammer, slamming into the submarine's hull with millions of pounds of force. The shockwaves bracketed the U-505 perfectly. Inside the submarine, the world ended. The concussive force picked the 1,100-ton vessel up and violently shook it. The main lighting circuits instantly blew out, plunging the terrified crew into absolute darkness, save for the weak, eerie glow of emergency battle lanterns. Glass dials shattered, spraying the control room with shrapnel. High-pressure air lines ruptured, filling the boat with a deafening, shrieking hiss. Pipes burst, and freezing seawater began spraying into the aft torpedo room and the engine compartment. But the most catastrophic damage occurred at the stern. The explosion warped the external hull and jammed the submarine's rudder, hard to starboard. The U-505 was now out of control, locked in a tight, submerged circle, and taking on water fast. Lang faced an impossible choice. If he stayed submerged, the flooding would quickly drag the boat past its crush depth, and the pressure hull would implode, instantly killing all 59 men aboard. If he surfaced, They would be sitting ducks in the middle of an American naval task force bristling with heavy artillery. He chose life. Lang screamed the order to blow the main ballast tanks with high-pressure air. At 11:22 a.m., just 1 minute after the depth charges detonated, the ocean's surface erupted in a geyser of white foam. The black, menacing conning tower of the U-505 breached the surface, water cascading off her heavily armed deck, less than 700 yards from the American destroyers. The sight of a surfaced German U-boat in broad daylight was a rare and shocking event. Every American gunner in the task force had spent months staring at empty water, waiting for this exact moment. The order to commence firing was not so much given as it was instinctively executed by hundreds of men simultaneously. The Wildcats rolled in from the sky, their 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds tearing into the submarine's conning tower, sparking brilliantly as they gouged trenches into the German steel. The destroyers opened up with everything they had. The 20mm Oerlikon cannons and 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns pumped a relentless stream of high-explosive fragmentation shells into the U-boat. The 3-inch main guns of the destroyers fired armor-piercing rounds that punched cleanly through the outer hydrodynamic hull, exploding against the inner pressure hull. The noise was apocalyptic. Inside the U-boat, Lang ordered the crew to abandon ship. He scrambled up the ladder, threw open the main conning tower hatch, and stepped out into a literal hurricane of hot lead. The moment Lang's head cleared the hatch, a piece of shrapnel tore into his leg, dropping him instantly. His executive officer, scrambling up behind him, was hit and killed. The German crew, panicked and believing they were being executed, began pouring out of the hatches and diving into the churning ocean. In their absolute terror to escape the sinking, bullet-riddled steel tomb, the German engineering crew made a fatal mistake. Standard Kriegsmarine scuttling procedure dictated that multiple explosive charges be set against the hull and all main sea valves be cranked open to ensure the boat sank in minutes. But with American shells tearing the boat apart and the lights out, the engineers panicked. They managed to open only one 8-inch sea strainer valve in the engine room before abandoning their posts and fleeing topside. The U-505 was taking on water, but not fast enough. Furthermore, because the crew fled in such a rush, they left the massive diesel engines running. With the rudder jammed hard to starboard, the U-505 was now a ghost ship, cruising in a tight circle on the surface at 7 knots, riderless, slowly sinking, and completely out of control. Aboard the USS Pillsbury, Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David watched the bizarre spectacle unfold. Captain Gallery's insane plan was actually happening. The U-boat was on the surface, the crew had abandoned it, and it had not yet exploded. The order was given, away boarding party. How do you board a hostile, heavily armed, 100-ton warship that is actively trying to sink itself, while running away from you in a high-speed circle? Historically, naval boarding actions were conducted by pulling 2 sailing ships alongside each other, throwing grappling hooks, and swarming over the rails with cutlasses. During the American Civil War, Sailors attempting to board ironclads like the CSS Virginia found it nearly impossible to gain a foothold on the sloped, greased armor plates. What Lieutenant David and his 8-man boarding party were about to attempt was infinitely more dangerous. They lowered a small wooden motor whaleboat into the choppy Atlantic swells. Armed with Thompson submachine guns, Colt 1911 pistols, and a bag full of hand grenades, these 9 men were tasked with chasing down a runaway submarine. The whaleboat's small engine whined as it tried to match the 7-knot speed of the circling U-boat. The ocean swells lifted the tiny wooden boat up and down, threatening to smash it against the steel hull of the submarine. As they pulled alongside the U-505, the reality of the situation set in. The deck of a Type IXC U-boat is narrow, covered in slippery teakwood slats, and sits very low in the water. With the submarine taking on water from the open sea valve, the stern was already beginning to slip beneath the waves. The propellers were churning violently, creating a deadly suction just feet away from the wooden whaleboat. Lieutenant David stood at the bow of the small boat, timing the rhythm of the ocean swells. As the whaleboat rose on a wave, bringing him level with the submarine's deck, he leapt. His boots hit the slick, wet wood of the U-boat's deck, and he scrambled to keep his balance, his Thompson raised and ready. One by one his men followed, throwing themselves across the gap, risking being crushed between the 2 vessels or chopped to pieces by the spinning bronze propellers. They were now standing on the deck of an enemy warship. The guns of the American destroyers had fallen silent to avoid hitting their own men. The only sounds were the roaring of the German diesel engines, the slapping of the waves against the hull, and the chaotic shouts of the German survivors floating in the water nearby. The boarding party moved tactically toward the conning tower, exactly as they had trained. This was not unlike American Marines clearing a Japanese bunker on Tarawa, except this bunker was underwater, sinking, and packed with high explosives. They had no idea if it was a trap. Were there die-hard Nazi officers waiting at the bottom of the ladder with MP-40 submachine guns? Were the scuttling charges on a time delay, ticking down to a catastrophic explosion that would vaporize the boarding party? Lieutenant David reached the base of the conning tower and looked up at the open hatch. Dead German sailors lay sprawled across the jagged, bullet-torn steel. The smell of diesel, fuel, cordite, and blood hung heavy in the humid ocean air. David gripped his pistol, stepped over the bodies, and peered down into the pitch-black abyss of the submarine's interior. Water was sloshing heavily somewhere deep in the belly of the boat. The U-505 was dying, and the ocean was waiting to claim her. Without hesitation, Lieutenant David swung his legs over the lip of the hatch and began the long, dark descent down the ladder into the flooded belly of the beast, knowing that the most guarded secrets of the Third Reich were waiting in the dark. The descent down the vertical steel ladder into the flooded belly of the U-505 was a plunge into an alien mechanical hell. Lieutenant Albert David's boots hit the deck plates of the control room, splashing into freezing seawater that was rapidly rising past his ankles. The air inside the pressure hull was foul, A toxic, suffocating mixture of diesel fumes, spilled battery acid, ozone from blown electrical circuits, and the metallic tang of human blood. Emergency battle lanterns cast long, distorted shadows across the shattered dials and ruptured high-pressure air lines. Every instinct in a sailor's mind screams to get out of a sinking steel tube, but David and his men pushed forward, their Thompson submachine guns sweeping the dark compartments for ambushes. They had to move with terrifying speed. The primary objective of this entire insane operation was not the submarine itself, but the cryptographic brain sitting inside its radio room. Radioman Stanley Doviak and torpedoman Arthur Knispel rushed the communications shack, kicking the door open to find the holy grail of naval intelligence. Sitting on the desk completely intact was the Rotor M4 Enigma machine. But the machine was only half the prize. Surrounding it were the current edition codebooks, the daily Rotor setting sheets, and the highly classified short signal ciphers, known as the Kurzsignale. These documents were printed on special water-soluble paper, designed to dissolve instantly upon contact with seawater, a failsafe engineered by the Kriegsmarine to prevent exactly what was happening right now. David's men frantically scooped the books into canvas bags, keeping them elevated above the rising floodwaters. What possesses a man to crawl into the dark belly of a sinking enemy warship, knowing that a single tripped wire or a delayed scuttling charge could vaporize him in an instant? It is the cold, calculated understanding that the intelligence gathered in this one room could save the lives of tens of thousands of Allied sailors. If we look back at the intelligence war of 1942, the United States Navy turned the tide of the Pacific War at the Battle of Midway, simply because Commander Joe Rochefort and his brilliant team at Station Hypo managed to crack the Japanese JN-25 naval code. Midway was an ambush built entirely on intercepted radio traffic, proving that reading the enemy's mail is just as lethal as dropping a 1,000-pound bomb on his flight deck. Capturing the U-505's Enigma materials was the Atlantic equivalent of the Midway intelligence coup, but it was achieved at the point of a gun. While the intelligence was being bagged, the boat was still dying. The water in the engine room was rising fast, pouring in through the 8-inch sea strainer valve that the fleeing German engineers had cranked open. Motor machinists mate Zenon Lukosius waded into the flooded aft compartment, the water now up to his waist, feeling around blindly in the dark, oily sludge for the source of the leak. He found the open valve, but the massive iron wheel was missing, likely removed by the Germans to prevent the Americans from closing it. In a moment of pure, desperate ingenuity, Lukosius found the steel cover plate lying in the bilge, wrestled it over the geyser of incoming seawater, and blindly threaded the heavy nuts back onto the bolts, cranking them down tight with a wrench. The roaring influx of the Atlantic Ocean suddenly stopped. The U-505 was secured, but she was riding dangerously low in the water, her stern nearly submerged, and her rudder still jammed hard to starboard. Now came the logistical nightmare. How do you tow a heavily damaged 1,100-ton steel cylinder hundreds of miles across the open ocean, through submarine-infested waters, while it is actively trying to sink? Captain Daniel Gallery, watching from the bridge of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, made a decision that defied every standard operating procedure in the naval manual. He ordered his 10,400-ton aircraft carrier to become a towboat. The Guadalcanal maneuvered dangerously close to the crippled submarine, passing a 2¼ steel tow wire over to the boarding party. The Americans on the U-boat's deck had to manually haul the massive grease-covered cable aboard and secure it to the submarine's towing bollard. When the carrier slowly throttled up to take the strain, the sheer drag of the water-logged submarine, combined with its jammed rudder, caused the tow cable to snap like a guitar string, whipping through the air with enough kinetic energy to cut a man in half. Gallery did not give up. He ordered his engineers to break out the carrier's massive anchor chain, a heavy, forged steel beast that could withstand the immense tensile stress. They passed the anchor chain to the submarine, secured it, and the Guadalcanal slowly, agonizingly, began to drag the U-505 forward at a sluggish speed of 3 knots. To keep the submarine from foundering, the Americans ran electrical cables from the carrier down to the U-boat, powering up the German bilge pumps to slowly clear the flooded compartments. This feat of brute force salvage is staggering when you compare it to modern naval operations. During the height of the Cold War in 1974, the Central Intelligence Agency spent hundreds of millions of dollars constructing the Hughes Glomar Explorer, a massive, custom-built salvage ship, designed specifically to claw a sunken Soviet Gulf II-class submarine off the floor of the Pacific Ocean during Project Azorian. Captain Gallery and Task Group 22. 3 effectively executed a similar strategic heist, but they did it on the surface, under the threat of enemy attack, using nothing but an escort carrier, a tow chain, and sheer American audacity. But capturing the hardware was only the first phase of the battle. The second, and arguably more critical phase, was the weaponization of Secrecy. If Admiral Karl Dönitz and the German High Command found out that the U-505 had been captured alive, they would instantly realize their Enigma codes were compromised. They would change the rotor settings, alter the cipher sheets, and plunge the Allies back into the intelligence blackout that had caused the slaughter of Operation Drumbeat in 1942. The capture had to be erased from existence. The 58 surviving German crewmen of the U-505 were pulled from the water and immediately locked deep in the holds of the American destroyers. They were stripped of their uniforms, isolated from each other, and explicitly told that under international law they were dead. The United States government notified the International Red Cross that the U-505 had been sunk with all hands lost. Dönitz held a memorial service for the crew in Germany, completely unaware that his men were currently eating American rations in the Caribbean. When the task force arrived at the secret naval base in Bermuda, the U-505 was painted to look like an American submarine and hidden away under the fictitious name, the USS Nemo. The German prisoners were quietly transported to Camp Ruston, a highly secure prisoner of war facility deep in the pine woods of northern Louisiana. Here they were kept in total isolation from the thousands of other German POWs held in the United States. They were not allowed to send letters home. They were not visited by the Red Cross, and they were guarded by hand-picked military police who were sworn to absolute secrecy. They spent the rest of the war playing baseball, picking cotton and living as ghosts in the American South. The intelligence extracted from the U-505 was a strategic goldmine that accelerated the destruction of the U-boat fleet. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park and Washington, D.C. used the captured materials to read German naval communications in real time, but the tactical hardware was just as valuable. Deep in the torpedo tubes of the U-505, American engineers found two G-70s, Zaunkönig acoustic homing torpedoes, known to the Allies as the T-5. These were the exact weapons that had been blowing the sterns off Allied escort ships. By reverse engineering the T-5, American technicians were able to perfect the Foxer acoustic decoy system, a towed noisemaker that confused the German torpedoes and rendered them virtually useless for the remainder of the war. This is the ultimate lesson of industrial multidimensional warfare. You do not just defeat an enemy by sinking his ships. You defeat him by stealing his technology, dissecting his doctrine, and turning his own mathematical genius against him. We saw this exact same strategic philosophy executed at the end of the war during Operation Paperclip, when American intelligence units raced across the collapsing Third Reich to capture Wernher von Braun and his team of V-2 rocket scientists. Capturing the enemy's hardware and brainpower is the ultimate force multiplier, bridging the gap between a tactical victory and a generational strategic advantage. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of numbers, a brutal economic spreadsheet where the American industrial base simply outproduced the German capacity to kill. Henry Kaiser's shipyards were launching Liberty ships in a matter of days, while the intricate, highly engineered German Type E U-boats took months to build and required highly trained, veteran crews to operate. By the time the U-505 was captured in the summer of 1944, the tonnage war was already a mathematical failure for Germany. The hunter-killer groups, built around the cheap, expendable jeep carriers, had turned the mid-Atlantic gap from a hunting ground into a slaughterhouse. Of the 39,000 men who served in the German U-boat arm during World War II, nearly 30,000 never returned, a catastrophic casualty rate of 75%, making it the most lethal branch of service in any military during the entire conflict. Captain Daniel Gallery and the men of Task Group 22. 3 proved that aggressive, unconventional tactics could break the back of a technologically superior weapon system. For his extraordinary heroism in leading the boarding party down into the dark, flooded, explosive-rigged belly of the submarine, Lieutenant Albert David was awarded the Medal of Honor, the only one awarded to an Atlantic Fleet sailor during the war. Today, the U-505 does not rest at the bottom of the ocean. She sits perfectly preserved, a massive 250-foot steel leviathan entirely indoors at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, Illinois. She is a monument to the thousands of sailors who froze and burned in the North Atlantic, and a physical testament to one of the most audacious acts of maritime piracy ever sanctioned by the United States government. Wars are not won merely by destroying the enemy's weapons, but by having the sheer, unyielding courage to reach into the dark, grab the enemy by the throat, and steal his secrets alive. Now, let us test your knowledge of submarine warfare. What was the primary method used by Allied escort carriers to hunt submerged U-boats in the mid-Atlantic Gap? A. Deploying massive underwater steel nets. B. Using high-frequency direction finding and acoustic homing torpedoes. C. Dropping unguided depth charges from high-altitude heavy bombers. Drop your answer in the comments below, and let us know what piece of military hardware we should dissect next.